As the Space Shuttle program began in 1981, NASA hoped providing payload launch services to paying customers would allow them to work around their decreasing federal budget. However, NASA continuously fell behind on their planned launches, increasing the pressure to meet demands of their customers. This pressure and publicity from the Teacher in Space program ultimately led to the decision to launch the Challenger space shuttle on January 28, 1986, which ended in tragedy after it exploded mid-flight, killing all 7 aboard. In response to this tragedy, President Ronald Reagan signed the United States Space Launch Strategy later that year, banning commercial and foreign payloads aboard the shuttle in hopes of alleviating NASA's schedule pressure. This directive led to the emergence of the private space industry, which NASA currently partners with. This partnership is a triumph for both sides, as private space companies can make a profit while helping NASA achieve their goals in planetary exploration. The success of the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969 was recognized by the American public as the end of the space race. The resulting decline in public and federal interest in space activities led to the end of the Apollo program, leaving NASA in need of new objectives. NASA had 4 successive goals requiring heavy funding from the government: build a space shuttle, build a space station, return to the moon, and conduct manned missions to Mars. Still, many politicians questioned whether to continue heavily funding NASA at the levels of the Apollo era. The New York Times reported,
"The very success of the Apollo 11 mission seems to have enhanced the interest in some congressional quarters in cutting the space budget."
President Richard Nixon echoed these sentiments, believing space programs no longer took precedence over domestic issues. Nixon decreased NASA's budget, explaining,
"Space expenditures must take the proper place within a rigorous system of national priorities."
In 1972, Nixon approved only the development of the space shuttle as it fit into NASA's reduced budget. The shuttle was specifically designed to bring government, foreign, and commercial payloads or cargo, such as satellites, into space. NASA hoped to profit off these payloads to work around their decreased budget. The Space Shuttle program began with the first launch on April 12, 1981. At the beginning of the Space Shuttle program,
President Reagan declared that it would be the only U.S. vehicle to carry payloads into orbit, which meant all commercial satellites would be carried by the shuttle.
the shuttle was the only way to access space, resulting in high demand from private and foreign customers for its payload launch services. NASA responded by increasing their planned flight rate to 24 launches a year by 1990, recognizing an accelerated schedule could lead to more profit. However, it took longer than anticipated to refurbish the shuttles after each mission, leading NASA to continuously fall behind schedule. This resulted in pressure to launch every shuttle on schedule, as NASA had a responsibility to deliver customer payloads on time. Allan McDonald explained,
"The private payloads brought with them requirements to meet planned launch schedules so that these satellites could start revenue-producing operations as soon as possible for the companies that were paying NASA for the launch services."
These demands from customers to meet launch requirements put pressure on NASA that intensified as they continued to fall behind schedule. Challenger Space Shuttle, the 25th shuttle launch, was originally scheduled for July 1985. This mission received intense publicity as it would carry the teacher in space candidate Krista McAuliffe, who was to teach 2 science lessons while in orbit. Journalist Mark Meyer stated,
"Next to the first Apollo moon landing in July 1969, this was the most intensely followed mission in NASA history."
However, payload changes and poor weather conditions caused multiple delays until the launch was finally scheduled for January 28, 1986, 6 months after the original launch date. On the eve of launch, Morton Thiokol, the contractors of NASA's solid rocket boosters, were concerned the Challenger launch was unsafe at the predicted temperature. Thiokol engineers set up an urgent teleconference with NASA and recommended not to launch Challenger, concerned their rocket boosters would not function properly in the low temperatures. The publicity of the teacher in space, coupled with stress to meet their planned schedule and keep up with payload assignments, resulted in NASA being under pressure to launch Challenger as planned the following morning. In response to Thiokol's recommendation, NASA's shuttle program manager Lawrence Malloy stated,
My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?
By the end of the conference, NASA managers persuaded Thiokol managers to retract the original recommendation of their engineers by threatening to terminate their contract. Challenger was cleared for launch. The following morning, on January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 crew members. The Challenger tragedy was a consequence of pressure to meet NASA's launch schedule, which was accelerated to accommodate commercial and foreign payloads.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger, but we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this.
Following the Challenger tragedy, a President's Commission called the Rogers Commission was established to investigate the cause of the disaster and recommend changes within the shuttle program. In the report published July 1986, there is heavy emphasis put on payload policy changes. The commission concluded,
NASA must establish a flight rate that is consistent with its resources. A firm payload assignment policy should be established.
Recognizing accommodating payloads put pressure on NASA that ultimately led to the Challenger tragedy, President Ronald Reagan signed the United States Space Launch Strategy in December 1986. This directive stated,
The recommendations of the President's Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident will be considered and incorporated as appropriate. NASA shall no longer provide launch services for commercial and foreign payloads.
This directive restricted the use of the shuttle as a payload launch service, formally opening the door for a private space industry to emerge and fill commercial and foreign launch needs. The Federal Aviation Administration later wrote,
The resulting unavailability of NASA as a private launch service led to the emergence of the U.S. commercial launch services industry.
The private space industry conducted its first successful launch in 1989. The Los Angeles Times reported,
The successful launch was an important milestone in a commercial space program started when former President Ronald Reagan told NASA to stop launching payloads for commercial customers after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in January 1986.
For the remainder of the Space Shuttle program, launching commercial and foreign payloads was in the hands of the private space industry, alleviating the payload and schedule pressures which had ultimately led to the Challenger tragedy. The end of the Space Shuttle program in 2011 brought NASA back to its remaining post-Apollo goals of returning to the Moon and conducting manned missions to Mars. With these goals of planetary exploration, but still operating on a low budget, NASA initiated a partnership with the private space industry in which NASA pays private companies to develop technology, deliver cargo to space, and construct rockets for future missions. Referencing this partnership, NASA's former acting administrator Robert Lightfoot wrote,
Our partnership incorporates private sector innovation into NASA missions. Strategic partnering allows the agency to better focus on new initiatives and improves the efficiency and effectiveness of our missions.
Partnering with a private space industry in this way is more cost-effective for NASA than developing their own technology and rockets, as they did during the Space Shuttle program. Allan McDonald explained,
Private individuals' launch services are much cheaper. NASA now can spend more money figuring out what we need to do in planetary exploration. That's a benefit to both parties. It's a benefit to the government, it's a benefit to the commercial industries.
This partnership is a triumph for both NASA and the private space industry. Private space companies can make a profit while they help NASA reach goals previously unattainable on a low budget. Two of the many ways NASA is utilizing this partnership to achieve their goals in planetary exploration is through contracting private company Blue Origin to develop lunar landing technology for future moon missions. Additionally, NASA hired 6 companies to develop prototype deep space habitats to be used for manned missions to Mars. The decision to launch Challenger was due to pressure of payload schedules on NASA. As a direct result of the Challenger tragedy, a directive banning payloads aboard the shuttle was enacted to alleviate schedule pressure, resulting in the emergence of the private space industry. The partnership between NASA and this industry is a triumph, as it makes space profitable for private companies while they help NASA achieve their goals in space.